So what does it... No, what am I asking? So how was it to have Granddad and Grandma feed Chris? And
this is feeding time at the maze. I just want to point out to you that there's two people...
Yoni had been down to New Zealand the year before to meet Mum and Dad.
Pan around to Yoni, quietly having her meal down at the table here. Then just pan back to these two, trying to feed.
But they hadn't seen Christopher, so we decided to go down for Christmas, and as we normally wanted to do that. We went down to New Zealand, and we didn't know at that stage that Dad only had about a year and a half to live from that.
We're just trying to get Dad to come out now and get a bit of a picture. He's sort of standing...
Someday soon, perhaps in 40 years,
I think we did.
there will be no one alive who has ever known me. That's when I will be truly dead, when I exist in no one's memory. I thought a lot about how someone very old is the last living individual to have known some person or cluster of people. When that person dies, the whole cluster dies too, vanishes from the living memory. I wonder who that person will be for me, whose death will make me truly dead. It is a quote from Irving D. Yalom's Love's Executioner and Other Tales of Psychotherapy, just one of his many all-too-human responses to that which he writes about. I think it is a common human anxiety, being forgotten. The ancient Egyptians believed it to be a fate worse than hell. As beings with awareness of the continuity of time, beyond ourselves, we want our lives to be endless, abundant, meaningful, remembered. We want to go down in history. The historian Jules Michelet resurrected the dead of his archive out of a similar desire. He says, "I have given to many of the disregarded dead the assistance that I shall myself need. I have exhumed them for a second life. They live now among we who feel ourselves to be their parents, their friends. Thus is made a family, a city community of the living and the dead. And in this the dead can become ghost." I first came upon this idea of dying after being forgotten, reading David Eagleman's Sum. It's a second-person address collection of 40 tales of potential afterlives. In this chapter, immortalized figures tread in the afterlife, exhausted by their continued existence, longing for the last time their name would be spoken. Einstein, Beethoven, in this moment of utterance, given life once more.
Do not forever with thy veiled lids seek for thy noble father in the dust. Thou knowest 'tis common, all that lives must die, passing through nature to eternity.
Whose death will make me truly dead? Who holds on to our ghosts? Who will let them go? What exorcises them from our mortal coil, severs us from each other in infinity and eternity? Sitting on the plane, waiting to see my father, I thought about these things. He asked me to help him make a video with the things he has of his father's rowing career, something similar to what he did with his rugby memories. I edited that video for him because I thought it could be more efficient, and I wanted to cut out his ums and ahs. This time, after dwelling on the nature of archives, I wasn't sure whether I should do the same. But more on that later. For me, this will be a video of my father, Richard Kenneth May, to capture his likeness, more than it will be to revive my grandfather, Kenneth Ernest May, whom I never met. But in the moment of making it, Kenneth will be revived. That is, his ghost will return through his archive. If my father thought he would never look upon his father's like again, he is to be, like Hamlet, met with the ghost in the very next scene. For memories haunt us, in the exact same way the real person might. I too will meet my grandfather, or rather, I will meet his things and his photos and his likeness and video, and, for the first time in any resemblance of entirety, stories about him. This last bit to me is the most important part. It is in the story that man is truly eternalized, not his remains, and it is especially in the story told by the right tellers. When my father carries on his father's memory, my father's death will not make him truly dead. The video will utter his name. The video to me is the archival medium with which we really revive the past. One man's artifacts, or that which remains in his son's archive, is not enough. We may seek for our noble father in these dusts, but the ghost will not appear until he has a place in the present. No, I don't think records and traces are enough to keep Kenneth's ghost alive. Perhaps his letters might, but those ephemera aren't made for the archive, even though they might end up there. It has been for centuries that the dominant archival material is text and record, and I believe this must necessarily be overtaken by audiovisual technologies. There have been problems with archives since their inception as a formal history-keeping device for mankind. Their claim to authority is one based in fundamentals in the development of Western culture. For example, the secular or other systemic control of public belief and education, or the ontological concept of memory as having some real manifestation in the world. The problems of this conception of the archive were most famously brought to life by philosopher Jacques Derrida, who deliberated on the way archives are mutable, fallible, invalid, irrepeatable. They reflect less of history than they do the history keeper and the things which this keeper chooses to repeat, preserve, or cut. The ontological view of memory represses these gaps, these lacunae, but these gaps return to haunt us. They make themselves known whether we want them to or not. And so there is another kind of ghost in the archive, not just the ghosts of those who have left us, but the ghosts of the parts of the archive which we have killed, or that have otherwise been smothered by the ontological archive. I believe that in the last century we have seen a disillusionment within historians with the formal, systemic, traditional Western archive of old, and within the general populace a return to a more natural archive, through memory. Psychologist and philosopher Jens Brockmeyer notes that for non-Westerners, memories are trans-individual or collective phenomena, cultural creations like myths, legends, and other stories that reverberate in the minds of generations. And for others still, memory is a personal part of the unconscious and conscious self, linking us with our own stories. The traditional systemic historian is likely to reject memory, or anecdote, and overemphasize empirical evidence. Ethan Kleinberg theorizes this comes from a financial need for history to take itself as a science. But the deconstructionist following historian knows to critique the privileged status of facts in history writing. When you relinquish the need for truth, Kleinberg says, when one lowers the evidentiary stakes, the focus can turn from hindering concerns such as whether or not ghosts exist, to useful questions like what ghosts can tell us about our relationship with the past, and the ghost-like nature of the past haunting the present. The dominance of ontological realism in the historical profession is no longer justifiable. In fact, it is harmful. But I believe that we are already in the trajectory of a recovery from this type of archive. More on this later.
Botany, the laws of nature, religion, philosophy, a collection of all the written data on Spanish moss in one place, none of it will ever or could ever equal, exchange, or exhaust the reality of this Spanish moss in itself.
So if we are never able to remember the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, in archives or even in stories, we must instead remember what? What is significant to me in this archive? My dad. The stories which he believes important, the memories which make him. I'm not calling him a fossil just yet, but it was Anna Boswell who spoke on fossils when she said that once any living thing passes into death, its impression or trace becomes indirect, and what is known about it will require technical aids and mnemonic supports. Well, Dad's getting on now. He's just turned 76, and while he acts and seems to be an unstoppable force, determined to continue rambling and rowing until 100, I'm only too aware of just how little time we might actually have left together. And I don't trust my memory, not in the slightest. I am one of those unfortunate victims of the detritus effect modern stress and prosthetic memory has had on my own intellectual archive collection and maintenance. That is to say, I have poor memory. But I don't wish to seek for him in the dust either, or in indirect sources, or in stories from others. All the stories of him being rowdy in his youth, did he tell you those stories?
No.
Who told you?
My Uncle Don told me.
Really?
I wish I'd had them earlier in life so I could talk to him about it. and say, when was this taken? They're right on the back of them. They never did. They only came to light when people were going through some old belongings or an old trunk, which is very sad. Well, when I looked at Italy Star, it didn't really hit me. And he never talked about Italy. And then I found this book, Soldier's Guide to Italy, so he must have been up there.
But you don't know anything about
No, I don't.
when or how long?
No.
Such is the problem of many traditional archives. We wish to hold on to the past, which is necessarily gone, but our memorabilia, the items which are prioritized in traditional archives, are not enough to revive it. When stories become detached from their objects, and it is only these objects left behind for the archivist to trace, the ghosts will lie dormant. At the moment, these anecdotes are somewhat footnotes, peripheral to the production of the artifact, sidekick to the main event of evidence, somewhat lost in Grandad's passing. We must instead bring them into focus and give them a place in the body of the essay.
People kind of focus on archives too late because, usually archives are, archived posthumously.
The problem thereafter is how to access these stories. Many subjects of the archive are long gone. Such is the limitations of the archive. They find their worth from a system measured capital value, and for the most part, it is only after they have already left us that we notice their import. As the saying goes, when an old man dies, a library burns. The rest is silence.
Draw thy breath in pain to tell my story. The rest is silence.
What we need is something of a Horatio to tell our tale. But if we have no next of kin or close friends, or they too have taken their libraries with them into the afterlife, then what we get are Michelets, if we are so lucky. The rest of us, that which remains of us, is silent, free game for others to ventriloquize. And now we are back to the problem posed by Derrida. Like a Shakespearean play, each artifact has potentially infinite interpretation, and each interpretation, while adding to the legacy of the text, will never be able to tell us, for sure, what the best, most true interpretation is. Hamlet can only wonder, drained at the loss of his father, before the ghost returns to tell him. Is this ghost real? We might wonder. Does it matter? I might answer. What if ghosts could speak to us, through us, act on our world as they do Hamlet's? If the text were to come straight from the creator's lips? It was just not possible for a long time, not with the way archives had been managed or had functioned, or the technologies we had to store them. But now it might be. In his essay, Tracking a Fevered Foray Through the Video Archive of the Web, writer and art historian Tedger Cole asks, what if the things that happened could be seen again as apparitions before us, and the people who did these things could speak as they spoke in life, and move about like the people you see in dreams? He seems to say in his essay that the answer is, we can, in video. Mediation might never match reality, but video at least can act and move like a dream, like a memory, like a ghost. Indeed, is there much difference between them? Dad's stories and memories can be captured here, and the items in his archives which would ordinarily be inert to me are now full of meaning.
Why was I shown the garden? Well, I think the house, when they bought it, had no garden. It was just of clay, bits and pieces. And I think the fact that they developed the garden, and in fact...
Suddenly, footage which had seen dead weight is now invaluable. Treasure. Like a scrapbook, personal and family archives are made up of things which are deemed important by the subject or their close relations. And Dad's revival of the ghost of Kenneth May is precious to him, and all the more precious to me for coming from his lips.
Hello. This particular tape is made in New Zealand. It starts in Wellington, and you'll meet a bunch of Mays.
Now, the memory of the memory too needs context. This, it seems, is something my dad is aware of naturally. As I capture his image, I too am aware of all the digital paratexts which tie it to the right temporal anchors, the time and date of filming, its MOV number in succession, its place in the folder on my iPad named Remembering Kenneth May, its place in the editing project I have up now named Dad Archive. In his book entitled Manatuturu, Moldy Treasures and Intellectual Property Rights, New Zealand filmmaker and writer Barry Barclay uses examples of innocent films with sinister backstories to stress how film is not a text that communicates truth. As Barclay puts it, truth in images text is will-o'-the-wisp. When I started this project, I had thought that what I had felt to be the need for stories was a need for context, and that Barclay was right when he focused on the importance of paratext for understanding the real truth behind a video. But I hadn't anticipated that I would develop instead a magnanimous attitude towards the truth. Context can be added for a purpose, but it's not to anchor the video in truth. I still hear from a lecture on Western metaphysics by Honorary Professor of Philosophy Micah Chewers.
So the phonetic alphabet was originally invented by slaves who were forbidden from reading the hieroglyphs in Egypt, reducing thousands of unique pictographs into just 25 utterly meaningless phonemes. And this vast distillation of language came with both unprecedented benefits for abstract thought, but also unforeseeable psychosocial costs. It marked a divorce of language from both its pictorial and oral traditions. This alphabetized West became the first to arrive at many new innovations and wisdoms, but also the first to abandon and forget old ones. Instead of a shared canon of codified myths and images, the alphabet actually forced individuals to abstractly conjure images and concepts for themselves much more frequently than they did in the past. But for many, the psychological effects of this new mode of cognition were just too abstract. So haunting every word and thought and image was the question, do we mean the same thing by this or that? Am I imagining this right? Are we on the same page? So each person was under a new kind of pressure to discern true from false for themselves.
So I wish to problematize the search for truth. Derrida likewise problematized the archive's search for truth and origins in his Psychoanalyst of the Archive. What I'm saying is, I don't think that this information is necessarily necessary, that truth is necessary. And yet it is the primary activity of many archives to categorize and date and contextualize every item in their collection. If it were to be lost, what would happen?
The second anecdote is from a story by Borges about how, I don't know if any of you have read this, about this villager who was a librarian. And what he would do is that because he didn't have the means to acquire the books and not enough funds, so he would read these interesting reviews of books, and based on the titles and the reviews, he would write his books. So if there is a complete loss of data, I think humanity is going to be always imaginative and inventive with the kind of stories and with the kind of meaning-making processes that we want to inhabit.
You may wonder why, then, it is important to me that video be the media with which we carry the stories of the archive. From one angle, I seem to be saying that the video holds the most amount of truth. Instead of your voice in your head reciting to you the words of someone else, the words are in their mouths, their voices. On a scale of sensory abundance, audiovisual technology has two. Still further is the evocation of the haptic sense, the projective touch memory, far more potent in movement on camera or sound than it is in static image or description. One only needs to look at the proliferation of ASMR videos on YouTube to notice how desperately we have been craving this sense and how voraciously we covet it. Sense of depth and size and lighting are all the more accurate with recorded movement. And the prescribed viewpoint of a gallery image in a museum database is made variable in a video. Are these all searching for truth? All these positives of the audiovisual media are artifacts from an outdated prioritization of the truth in archival practice. The value of the video is its celebration of the made truth, its ability to alter. I'll elaborate. Is not the visual image, full of signs and void of text, more akin to the rich hieroglyphs of the pre-phonetic alphabet method of communication? I agree with Kleinberg when he says that we are held back in our views of digital technology by an analog ceiling. That these Digital innovations in theory and form can change the way we research, write, and teach about the past, but we are constrained by a print, published paper past, so that the e-book is indistinguishable from the codex. I do not flick through the letter to give the viewer a sense of what the letter is truly like to handle, though that is what they will get. Instead, it is to give a sense of the video's interaction with the world it has created, to give signs for my father's sites of significance, without mourning the loss of every word I skip or move too fast over or fail to focus the camera on. This is not to say that the information and content is unimportant, but that it is not important that through video we lose it. To break through this analog ceiling would give the opportunity to reconceptualize historical works as multimodal, multitemporal, and multimedia, so as to resist the presentation and restrictions of a monolithic temporal narrative. In video, the disconnected events of my grandfather's writing of the letter, of my father's discovery of it, our reading, and his revival of it in story, are layered and converge in a way that prioritizes or focuses our interaction with the past and time over the content it communicates. The video itself exposes the ghosts of its creation in every cut. And yes, in the end, I did decide to cut much, though not all, of the dead air and empty ums of the footage. The film is an incredibly crafted medium. In every historical reenactment or elaborative supplement in a documentary, like my screen recording of scrolling through YouTube, is an awakening of the moments of creative craft which goes into an archival documentary, like Dad's, or a sprawling video essay like mine. The viewer is alert to these presences, to these processes. And these cuts, in a way, are perfect. The mistruth they convey, precious. The cuts are then less about what is lost than they are about the caring valuing of footage. Like a bonsai, the smaller it is, the more care you can imagine goes into the creation. Kleinberg goes on to explain, in these models, time and space is or can be out of joint, and it is in this way that new forms align with a hauntological narrative reconstruction focused on non-simultaneity, divergent historical paths, and the instability of time. Here, we are talking about the multiple heterogeneous iterations of narrative form, threaded through itself in a non-linear polysemic topology, one that defies the smooth continuous strategies of ontological realism, but coincides much more closely with what we know about space and time, and how, to Kleinberg's mind, we should think of the latent ontology of the past. Such a narrative accommodates an understanding of what Kleinberg calls the past as something that is, as present and absent at the same time, as something and nothing, entangled in a seemingly impossible way, where the iterative position of the historian is woven into the past and the present, such that it also presses upon the future. Video, then, to me, holds memory and history in new ways, unappreciated by fading archival mindsets. It opens connections, with the potential to expand out into infinity, all the while centering the focus on the process and presentation. I can put any two videos together and show almost anything I wish. Show the passage of time, or the lack of, imagine a provenance, or fabricate the life. Ephemera and artifact become eternal cinema, becomes artefact, becomes ghost. Things can be made alive when they are dead. The past can press on the future. King Hamlet can command Hamlet the prince. Video provides, more importantly than the affect of artifacts, the philosophies of their ghosts. You may wonder why I might say the traditional archival mindset is fading. Already, scholars have in recent years been writing on the outdated colonial practice of archives and their misplaced ownership over record keeping. The democratization of archive-producing platforms in popular social media and digital storage has changed archive keeping for the public faster than the institution can keep up. Brockmeyer tells us our processes of remembrance and our very notion of memory are transforming under the impact of the digital revolution, newly charged with new ideas of malleability, mutability, and constructivity. Digital technologies then provide far more than infinite capacity for storage. They support and mimic just that transformative nature of autobiographical remembering, of human memory. People edit and remix their memories just as they edit and remix their video life logs, manipulating sounds, pictures, and moods, taking an active role in their record keeping, which is rife with flexibility and wobbly temporality. These shifts present a fuller capacity for memory, fuller in that they are full products of the full desires of their makers, who, almost invariably, are also their subjects. While essay documentary innovator Hito Sterol sees the struggle over copyright issues on YouTube to be a sign that online platforms will never be able to break free of the confines of nation and capital, I believe these conflicts are a symptomatic process of breaking free of subject-editor monopoly and institutions struggling to keep up with the shift. In this flexibility of fact and fiction and focus on the self, we find room for the ghost, however real we choose it to be. For so long, archives have been pilfered from the remains or collected from others without their control. Think about exoticizing photographs of indigenous peoples, or stuffed birds, nailed butterflies. As if the archiver is the main character of the story, and the other is exclusively ethnographic object. Historian Carolyn Steedman even tells us that the historian who goes into the archive must always be an unintended reader, will always read that which was never intended for his or her eyes. Must they always? It is an Anglo-anthropocentric colonizing view of the world, where the valuing of the dead over the living archive, as well as the eagerness to place others in the realm of object, dictate who makes and accesses histories. But if the archived human has explicit control and investment in the project, we may finally see how the human desire to be remembered, to be eternalized, might act without the restriction of truth-seeking history. Will things be lost in this process? Of course, but more still remains, more truth than can ever be found in rummaging through the dust, and more too that is exciting about the future.
I think it goes without saying that archives are entirely dependent on mediums of remembrance, right? Mediums of memory. And those mediums of memory have continuously been changing over centuries and centuries. In the Greek era, Greek classical era, Socrates and Plato's and Aristotle's entire debate would be that memory and knowledge should be embodied. It's in fact a contamination of memory if it's written down. When, say, the Gutenberg Revolution was happening, you have parchments being replaced by the printed book. And there'd be huge debates and huge crises as to know these printed books are a contamination or they're not true knowledge. It's the parchments as those manuscripts which are for real. And now in the digital era, there's all this paranoia about how the internet is not a reliable source of information. We still have to rely on books. So these are entire regimes by which knowledge circulated.
There is nothing to say that archiving must be done by the archivist. When we actively add to archives together, collaboratively, while alive, we open up so many opportunities for stories and lives to make meaning for and with each other.
We've tended, like so many of the researchers who use personal archives, to treat them as source material, the flotsam of a life lived, pieces that can be patched together to tell a story about their creator's life, or give insight into how the creator's work developed and evolved, or provide general information about a time and place, what life was like then.
And we can do so much better than that. Our ghosts can act on the present, accrue a new value. We won't make the dead speak, they will haunt us, as they always have done, haunting until we rescue them from the indifference of the present, the inertness of the archive. And we will make room for them. As I capture Richard May frame by frame, I have a creeping sense of the becoming ghost. Looking at the footage, he feels familiar and unfamiliar, dead, though I know he is alive, and present, although we are parting.
Plus l'effet de mort qu'il y a toujours dans les photographies, comme maintenant d'ailleurs, la mort rôde là. Bon. Alors il y a cette espèce de presque de superstition.
To record this moment of adding to my archive feels ominous, but I wouldn't want to go without it. And I will continue to add and save and build his ghost for the future. If my father is posthumously recognized for some great achievement, his fans will be able to meet him in a unique, rare way, but a way which is becoming more common now. And even if he isn't, it is enough for me to have this. Enough that my child will be able to meet their grandfather, as I could not.